was not a trace of a smile on Mike's face, only a look of great pity. It was odd, Caroline thought, that a man in the shape he was in should feel sorry for someone like Mr. Shalimar. "You know how it is when people talk all the time about some celebrity," he said. "Mr. Shalimar knows Eugene Winnell, but Eugene Winnell doesn't know him." "My gosh," April said, biting her thumb. "Be nice girls," Mike said. "Forget I ever opened my mouth. But treat Mr. Shalimar with all the respect you have at your command. He's a very bitter man, but he has cause. It's a dreadful thing to know you're 55 years old and you have to worry all the time about losing a job that isn't even good enough for you." "Why should he lose his job?" Caroline asked. "Bright young people, people like you, for instance, kids with ambition, who write brilliant reports out of sheer instinct. A man who has to live in a past that never really was is afraid of a lot of things." "But not of me," Caroline said incredulously. "Not you now. No. Right now you're nothing to him. But you in another 2 years. That's a different story. Listen to him. Pay attention and respect him when he teaches you anything about the business you're in. Don't think you're smart. Just listen. And remember." He had begun to slur his words, and Caroline realized that he was, finally, very drunk. He pulled a handful of crumpled bills out of his pocket and dropped them onto the table. "This'll pay for the drinks and probably a sandwich for you two kids," he said. He put his hands flat on the table and assisted himself to his feet. "See you tomorrow." "Oh, thank you very much, Mr. Rice," April said. "Yes, thank you," Caroline murmured. She was troubled and thinking. She didn't want to be a success if that meant watching out for people with dark HVs who were afraid of you for no reason you could fathom. This morning she had been afraid even to speak to Mr. Shalimar. This evening he was fondling her leg, and she was being told that someday he would be afraid of her. She was thinking that she didn't like the working world at all, and yet, underneath, she was exhilarated. It was all like a dream in which you could have anything you wanted, if you were very, very careful. Mike Rice leaned over and touched her eyebrows where they were drawn together. His fingers were very gentle. "Did I say, don't think you're smart?" he said. "I'll tell you something. I'll amend it. Don't let anyone know you think you're smart. Because you know something. You're damn smart." He patted her cheek and walked off swiftly, making an obvious effort to walk straight. His camel's hair coat tossed askew over one shoulder like a cape. "What's he talking about?" April asked, looking after him. "One don't know," Caroline said. Yet, they ate at the same bar, and then Caroline telephoned her mother and bought a toothbrush and went with April to April's apartment. There was a baby carriage in the downstairs hallway, and 2 garbage cans, and a row of mailboxes on one wall. As Tlaish embed the stairs, Caroline heard the sound of a television set from one apartment and shrieks from another where a party was going on. The door was ajar at the party apartment. "Look," April nudged Caroline. "Everyone's so friendly in this house. You could walk right in. It's so smoky in there they probably wouldn't know the difference." April's apartment was dark. She switched on the light and ran to the window. "Look at my garden, Caroline." Caroline was looking at the room. It was tiny, and April's clothes were scattered here and there. There was a coffee cup with some cold coffee in it, standing on the bridge table, next to a pile of all the latest fashion magazines. There were 2 doors, one of which might have led off to another room, since there was no bed in sight. In fact, there was almost no furniture, and no rug. It was seedy, you had to admit that, but Caroline felt her heart begin to pound. It could be fixed up so easily, and it could be enchanting. How wonderful to have an apartment of one's own. One's own things around, one's own taste everywhere. "The bed is in the wall," April said. "I'll sleep on the box spring and you can have the mattress. Here's my bathroom, and this is the closet. This closet is the kitchen. Come see my garden, Caroline." Caroline looked out the window, down 3 floors, and saw dimly the outline of trees. They were spindly city trees, it was true, and it was hardly April's garden except to look at. But as soon as she saw it, Caroline was sold. "One love your apartment. You're so lucky. Do you think so?" April's face lighted up with delight. "I was afraid you'd think it was a dirty old tenement. I didn't expect you to HV in a penthouse on $50 a week." "Oh, I know. It's just terrible not to have enough money." I can't even go to the movies at night after I get finished paying for my rent and phone and food. I have to sit here every night and read magazines. I met a girl who lives in this house and works at Fabian. Her name is Barbara Lamont. She's secretary to the beauty editor of America's Woman, and she's going to give me all the fashion magazines when she gets through reading them. They get all the magazines free over there. I've started to read some already. April smiled self-consciously, like a child. You know what? I'm getting an education. Do you want some cocoa? Love some. April began to putter around in her closet kitchen, making cocoa. I would never have met Barbara at Fabian because she works on a different floor. It's like a different world down there. My heavens, they have a regular kitchen on the 31st floor where they make all the recipes they take pictures of. Most of the food they can't even eat afterward because they put coloring on it to photograph better. Isn't that a terrible waste? But sometimes they let the girls take home something wonderful, like a roast turkey. I think I ought to ask for a transfer. If I sound like I'm drooling, it's because I am. I'm Alexi's hungry lately. I'm not used to eating just a box of Fig Newtons for supper. Back home we used to have enormous meals. She put the 2 cups of cocoa on the bridge table, swept a pile of clothes off one of the bridge chairs, kicked off her shoes and sat down. Caroline took the other chair. I wish, April went on, that I would meet a boy who would take me out to dinner and be good to me. Who am I kidding? I wouldn't care if he never took me out to dinner, just as long as we liked each other a lot. Do you know that Barbara Lamont is only 20 years old? Our age. And she's already been married and divorced and has a baby 1-year-old. Did you see that baby carriage downstairs? That's hers. She's trying to sell it. She doesn't have any money either. Nobody I know has any money. That's kind of sad about the baby carriage, Caroline said. Most people save baby carriages for the next baby. It's a little as if she doesn't expect to get married again. It is, isn't it? April said, but I guess she doesn't have room for it. None of the apartments in this house are very big. She lives with her mother and the baby. Her father's dead. I bet she has a hard time on dates. Being married before, you know. I know, Caroline said. She was curled up cozily in the chair with her arms around her knees, and she hadn't had cocoa since she was a little girl. She was beginning to have that feeling that comes after midnight, of one's thoughts opening out, flowering, groping out loud for some new discovery. Some new truth Pleiad is really as old as all the hundreds of years girls have been confiding to one another in the relaxing intimacy of the night. Boys are funny. They seem to think that girls who have been married before can't live without sex. I wonder if it's true. Do you think so? I wonder too, April said. She turned her cocoa cup around in her hand, looking at the roses that were painted on it as if they were very fascinating. Are you a virgin? I must admit I am. Are you? Oh, sure. What do you mean? Admit? None of the girls back home will admit they aren't, if they aren't, which I don't know. I'm not so proud of it, Caroline said. It's just something I can't quite bring myself to give up. If my mother heard me talking about this in such a casual way, she'd have a fit. She taught me only 2 major rules for life. Don't let boys touch you, and join the Radcliffe Club. April smiled. Mine never taught me anything like that because we just don't talk about sex at our house. You just assume that every girl who isn't married is a virgin, unless there's somebody who there's a scandal about. My mother would no more tell me not to sleep with a boy than she would tell me. Not to sleep with a boy than she would tell me not to go out and steal a car. She knows I wouldn't think of it. But you do think of it. I think about it all the time. That's a little different though. When I'm 26, if I'm not married by then, I'm going to take a lover, Caroline said. Really? April sounded a cheetle shocked. Then she thought about it. I think you're right. If you're that old, you have a right to live. I wanted to sleep with Eddie, Caroline said. He was my fiancé in college. I really wanted to, but at the last minute, I was always afraid. I think it was a combination of being afraid I'd lose him and being scared that going all the way wasn't going to be as wonderful as everything I'd always imagined. I guess people build it up in their minds as being something marvelous, and then they wait and wait, and then it gets to be too important. Like the first kiss, or the first anything. It ought to be an accident, not something you plan too carefully, or else you're apt to be disappointed. I guess TA sounds awfully naive, April said. But when I try to picture going to bed with somebody, I can never figure out where fly sheet and blankets go. Do you do it underneath the blanket? Or do you take the blanket off? Caroline couldn't help laughing. Didn't you ever neck on a bed with somebody? My heavens, no, not on a bed. Elle, when the time comes, whoever he is, he'll know what to do about the blanket. They were silent then for a few moments, each with her own thoughts. If you were to take a lover next week, April said, just pretend, who would you want it to be? What land of man would you want for your first? Someone I love, Caroline said, and above all, someone considerate, who had enough experience to know what he was doing. Someone older, April said. I think it should be an older man, not too old. Oh, no, but at 21 either. Just pretend that you could have anybody and you had made up your mind to have a love affair. Who would you want? It could be a movie star, or someone in the office, or anyone. All right, Caroline said. Do you know? In an am who? All of a sudden she did know, and the choice seemed as natural as if she had always known it, and as exciting as if it were crazily, improbably possible. This is just pretend, mind you. Of course, Mike Rice, said Caroline. Chapter 4, girls like Caroline, who have just finished 15 uninterrupted years of educational routine, find themselves still dividing the year into seasons in the way they are used to, rather than by the calendar. January the 1st is not the birth of the new year. September is. Spring is not a time of hope and blossoming. It is a time of leave-it-taking and faint pangs of unhappiness. The year breaks in half at the end of January, which is the time of exams, panic, dirty clothes, sleepless nights, and frantic last-minute studying. It was therefore very strange to Caroline to find herself at the end of January in New York with nothing to stir her up emotionally. She'd been taking home a manuscript every evening to read and report on, and although at first she had to write the comments over and over like a composition in order to make them short and to the point, she soon had the knack of it and could type her feelings directly onto the awful BCIL comment sheet. The first few books she reported on, she felt as though she would never be able to be an editor, but at the end of 3 weeks she had learned something startling and encouraging. That a thing which seems mysterious can finally become almost automatic. In fact, at the end of January, she began to feel a slight touch of resentment that Mr. Shalimar kept gobbling up her extra hours production without ever giving her any sign of encouragement that she would be allowed to become an OFLBCL reader. She had fallen into the habit of taking the 7 o'clock express to Port Blair about 3 nights a week. Those evenings she would first stop at the Fabian bar to have a drink with Mr. Shalimar, Mike, April, and 1 or 2 or 3 of the other OFLBCE girls whom Mr. Shalimar managed to take in tow. She was pretty sure that Mr. Shalimar caved her, because she and April were the only regulars. She did not like him particularly. She could not quite get over her fear of him, a fear which kept her from falling into a trance when he started telling his same old stories for the benefit of each new girl. The 2 things which kept her accepting his invitations were her desire to become anything like a member of the inner circle, and her companionable feeling for Mike Rice. She always managed to seat herself across the table from Mr. Shalimar, not next to him, so some other girl than herself would have to be the unwilling recipient of the affectionate hand. That meant she would find herself elbow to elbow with Mike. She often looked at him on the sly and had the same feeling about him as she had about April's apartment the first time she saw it. That so much could be done to improve the rundown femininity. Mike had the kind of aristocratic, well-formed face and athletic, if wiry body, that it is very difficult to destroy. He seemed to be doing his best to try that. Despite her midnight conversation with April, that one night Caroline never really thought of Mike as a romantic possibility. She wasn't quite sure how she considered him. She hoped he could someday be her friend. She knew that she trusted him, and that he represented a kind of HFE and a kind of world that were a mystery to her. And an interesting one. She never compared him to Eddie, nor brought up thoughts of Eddie as a defense against him. Eddie was a wound that had not yet healed, as if some important part of herself had been torn away. If she had gone out regularly with another boy, she would have been compelled to compare him with Eddie, but she did not have to compare Mike Rice with anyone. In fact, there was no one in her limited sphere whom she could have sensibly compared with Mike anyway. Preoccupied as she was with her own feelings about a situation that was still new to her, Caroline could not help noticing the slow change that was coming over April. The first indication was the morning after their first payday, when April appeared triumphantly in the bullpen with her gold hair shorn, snail-curled and lacquered. The effect, or rather, the contrast, was somewhat frightening, like seeing a picture of one of those ancient Egyptian princesses quite bald without her headdress. At 5 o'clock that day, April cornered Caroline. "It's wrong, isn't it?" April said timidly. "There's you something not quite right." "It's a bit stiff," Caroline said kindly. "I want it to look like you," April said. "Tell me where you have yours done." The next day, April returned looking like a stranger. Fluffy short hair, new penciled eyebrows that gave her a gamin look, and some kind of pale powder base that hid the farm girl freckles. Caroline had forgotten what a really beautiful face April had, but now it was completely apparent. April was wearing a very simple black jersey dress that she had seen in one of her second-hand fashion magazines. "Well, look at the movie star," Mr. Shalimar said. April still could blush, even under the Elizabeth Arden icing. "I bought 2 more dresses and shoes and a handbag and a coat, and charged the whole thing," she confided to Caroline. "I'll be paying it off for the next year." "It was worth it," Caroline said. "You look lovely, really lovely." When April smiled, her new eyebrows made her look reckless. Or perhaps it was the line of the hair curving around her face. "Did you hear what he said? Who? Pale Hands I Love by the Shalimar. Oh, honestly, you're terrible." April breathed, laughing, and hurried into Mr. Shalimar's office, holding her shortly in pad in one hand and smoothing her skirt with the other. Miss Farrow had a temporary secretary, the girl Caroline had seen sitting nervously in the reception room some weeks before. They might as well hire a temporary girl, Mike had told Caroline. None of them stay with her longer than a few months anyway. The girl was named Greg Adams, and she was an actress. Caroline realized there must be thousands of actresses she had never even heard of, who make perhaps $200 a year doing walk-ons in television and bits in off-Broadway productions, and who spend the rest of year time making rounds and waiting fitfully in unavoidable temporary office work. This girl, Greg, was of medium height and slender, with the face of a 14-year-old. She had long straight blonde hair, not the stringy kind, but the sort that swayed all in one piece when she moved quickly. She wore all the necessary makeup but lipstick, which added to the teenage look. Caroline was astonished to learn that she was 23 years old. Greg had the sort of mouth that made smoking a cigarette look somehow sinful. Miss Farrow treated her new secretary as one might treat a horse or a dog until the ASPCA caught up. She had a contempt for temporary office help, holding that by the time you taught them anything they were gone anyway, so it was a waste of time. "You know what Miss Farrow did last Friday?" Mary Agnes told Caroline breathlessly. "She gave a cocktail party and invited Greg to come. And then she made Greg spend the whole evening carrying hors d'oeuvres to the guests and emptying ashtrays and making drinks. Just like a maid. Did you ever hear such a nerve? What did Greg do about it?" "Not lying," Mary Agnes said. "You're crazy," Caroline told Greg later in the ladies' room. "If you let her push you around like that, she'll do worse next time." "It's all right," Greg said sweetly. She had a very tender, litty girl voice. "Afterward, before I went home, I stole 2 bottles of scotch." Caroline liked Greg, and they began to have lunch together nearly every day, often with April. Greg came from Dallas, from an upper-middle-class family, and Caroline couldn't resist asking her immediately if she knew Helen Lowe. She didn't, but she had heard of the family. Of course, Greg was the youngest of 3 sisters, and she had spent most of her time in boarding schools, always alone because her nearest sister was 5 years older and was in college when Greg was starting high school. The parents had each been divorced and remarried several times. "If I ever get married," Greg told Caroline, "I'm going to stay married. I've been saying goodbye to people all my life and I'm sick of it." The middle sister, in Texas, was 28 and starting her 3rd marriage. The oldest was divorced also. "We're not a very faithful family," Greg said, "except me. I've got all the glue they forgot to hand out to the rest of the family. If I only had somebody to use it on." Neither Caroline, Greg, nor April seemed to be able to meet many boys in New York. Caroline managed a date every 2 weeks, mostly blind dates who were too dreadful to see again or pass on to her friends. And Greg knew several boys from her dramatic class who had as little money as she did. Greg's mother sent her money, enough for rent on a tiny apartment, food and some clothes, but not for the acting classes or the ballet lessons she was taking at night, which was why she had to put up with Miss Farrow at Fabian. "Look," Greg said to Caroline, "if you want to live in New York, why don't we share an apartment? I have 2 studio couches in my apartment, and we could share the rent, which is $100 a month. You could never find a decent apartment yourself for $50. When I get to be a reader and I get my raise, I will," Caroline said. "Hooray! No more cleaning LaFarrow's latrines. A year away from that bitch is like 5 minutes away from anybody else." Greg lived in a second-floor walk-up over a Chinese laundry in a respectable and safe, if rundown, neighborhood. The proprietor of the laundry had a yearning for fresh air and kept the door to his establishment wide open all day, winter and summer. Walking past it to enter the house, you could hear the whoosh of the pressing machine, and on cold days, the clouds of steam rising into the air gave anyone entering Greg's apartment the feeling that he was boarding a train. Caroline didn't mind it at all, and she liked the apartment, which, being in a converted brownstone, had enormous windows from floor to ceiling with dome tops like the windows in a church. There was a tiny balcony outside each window, just large enough for several inches of grit and soot and Greg's striped alley cat, who used the balconies for his daily promenade. There was now more reason than ever to want the promotion, and Caroline began to worry about it. Mr. Shalimar's secretary had long since returned, so April was back in the typing pool and could not tell Caroline whether or not he was considering doing anything about her reports. Every afternoon he would stop briefly at Caroline's desk and say, "Thank you for your comments. They're very useful." Once in a while he would say, "I read your comment with interest, and I hope to God you're wrong." She didn't want to push him or appear anxious, but she began to have sly fear that he was using her to do 2 jobs at once for the salary of the lesser one, and she didn't quite know what to do about it. Meanwhile, she typed up any odd work that there was no one else to do, helped the other girls, and walked past Mr. Shalimar's office whenever she could think of a good excuse to do so. Not because it would do her any good, but because it made her feel better. She began to find an influx of work from Miss Farrow's awful BC piled on her desk. She did it without question for a few days, and then one day she asked Greg, "Is this all from you?" "Not that I mind, but I have so much of my own." "Miss Farrow puts it there herself," Greg said. "Half the time I don't have enough to do. Either she really thinks I'm a moron or else she's just partial to your brand of typing." "Partial," said Caroline. "Now I wonder." With her regular work in Miss Farrow's editions, Caroline was rushed all day and exhausted at the end of the day, so that the manuscripts she read at night were no longer pleasure but almost a nuisance. She would have put Miss Farrow's work off as a matter of course, but every pile carried a handwritten note. "Rush," or "Today, please," or "To be done immediately." Caroline knew she wasn't any better a secretary than any of the other girls in the pool, and she began to wonder why she was the only one singled out for these extra jobs. One day at 4:45 she was finishing up when Miss Farrow came out of her awful BCE and dropped a sheaf of letters on her desk. "These have been corrected. Will you type them, please? Miss Bender, and put them on my desk before you go home. I don't think I'll be able to finish them today, Miss Farrow." Miss Farrow's eyes narrowed. She took a deep breath. "Listen, you little bitch," she said. "You think you're a reader, but you're not. You're just another typist here, and don't you forget it. You are not an editor." She turned and walked quickly back to her office. "What did she say?" Mary Agnes said. "What did she say? You look like she hit you in the face." For a moment, Caroline was so shocked that she didn't feel anything. Then she felt like crying, and a moment later, when she figured it out, she felt like laughing. "I guess," she said to Mary Agnes, "she said I'm going to get to be a reader after all." It was odd, she thought, how quickly one could become attuned to the undercurrents of office feeling. The fears, the jealousies, the connivings, and the secret panic. It was not safe to think that anyone was unafraid. Certainly if Mr. Shalimar was mistrustful of young ambition, then Miss Farrow must be. The girls like Mary Agnes, who had no ambition except to do their work satisfactorily, disappear at 5 o'clock on the dot, and line up at the bank on payday, were the backbone of the office, and the office could not run without TM. But the company would not make money if every worker in it was like Mary Agnes. And everyone knew it, from Mr. Fabian right down to Mary Agnes herself. It was the eager newcomer, the foe mentor, who set the panic wheels turning and the people like Miss Farrow were so watchful that they knew who she was before the newcomer knew it herself. It was naive of me, Caroline thought, to think that I could become an editor without stepping on someone's toes, or perhaps even on his shoulders, and here I am without the least desire to or idea of how to begin. Gee, that's great, Mary Agnes was saying. And you here such a short time too. You know, if you're going to be a reader, you don't have to do all Miss Farrow's extra work like that. You won't even have time to read for Mr. Shalimar. She keeps piling it up on you. You ought to go and tell him. I wouldn't let her get away with it. Did I say I don't have the least idea of how to begin? Caroline thought Mary Agnes knows how to get along better than I. You're right, she said. Thanks, Mary Agnes. She was planning what she would say to him the next day as she went down in the elevator, carrying the evening's manuscript. She would have liked to stop to talk to him right then, but his door was closed and she was in a hurry to meet Mrs. Nature's blind date, who had finally called. She vaguely resented this boy Alvin Wiggs, whoever he was, because his presence and his plans for her stood like a barrier between her and something which had gradually become very important in her life. The hesitant voice on the telephone that afternoon had not warmed her, nor had it promised anything, but the manuscript she hugged under her arm promised a great deal. Now you mustn't do work every night. Her mother had told her several times to have to go out on dates too. All work and no play. You know, I'd go out all right if anyone called me, she had answered. Well, now someone had called her, and he was waiting for her in front of her office building. She recognized him instantly, even though she had never seen him before. He was the one person in the crowd who looked as if he didn't know where he was going, walking nervously in and out of the revolving door, looking anxiously at every girl who came out. He was about Tliarty, of medium height and half-bald Caroline Bender. He said in a loud voice as soon as she stopped, "Are you Caroline?" Several Fabian girls turned to look at him and Caroline curiously at the sound of her name. Caroline wanted to shrink into her skin. "S?" she said quietly. She took his arm and began to lead him down the street to a safe distance. He was looking at her from head to toe. He had moist, anxious eyes, and he seemed terrified. She let go of his arm. "You must be Alvin Wiggs," she said pleasantly. "That's me." "Well?" she said. Now he was walking, leading her uptown. "We'll have dinner at Schraffhoff's," he said. Schraff's, she thought, where I have lunch with April and Greg every day. A tomato surprise and a strawberry soda with all Tlios ladies and Alvin Wiggs. "Oh, is that one of your favorite restaurants?" she said. He seemed flustered. "I've never been there, but my mother goes there all the time. Don't you want to go?" "Well, I'd rather go somewhere a little more, well, darker, with music, if you don't mind." "I thought girls liked Schraffhoff's," he said hesitantly. "You know, small portions. We'll go any place you Maybe he has no money," she thought. No, Mrs. Nature said he was in his father's business. They walked east toward Madison Avenue, and after passing several restaurants Caroline liked, they finally stopped. They were in front of a small, dark restaurant Caroline had heard of, which was supposed to be inexpensive and have good food. "How about this?" she said. "All right." They went in, walked past the tiny bar, and were ushered to a table. They were the only people in the dining room. "Cocktail," the waitress said. "Oh, no," said Alvin. "Not for me. You don't want one, do you?" "It's only 5:15, Caroline said. "I'd like to have one first, unless you're hungry." She ordered the scotch and water and Alvin Wiggs ordered nothing. She felt a little self-conscious drinking alone, but she knew that if she didn't, she would never be able to get through an hour with him. She looked at him and smiled brightly. "I should have brought you some of our latest books," she said. "Are you reading anything good lately?" "I don't like books," he said. "It takes me about 7 Montes to get through a novel." "I like financial magazines." She tried again. "It's a shame you haven't found any books you like. What was the last one you read?" "I don't remember." What interesting ice cubes those were in her glass. They had tiny bubbles in them. She had never seen ice cubes that drew her attention so. "Mrs. Nature is a nice woman." "Isn't she?" he said. "Yes, she is. She's very nice. I like her." "Have you met Francine's husband?" "No," he said. "I hear he's very nice. I like Francine." "Tess," she said. Francine's nice, he said. Oh, we forgot Mr. Nature, Caroline thought. She wanted to laugh. It was all of 5:30. May I have another scotch, please? Are those good? Yes, they're very good. Maybe I'll try one. I don't drink much. You'd better not. Well, I'll try one, he said. Maybe he's just shy, she thought hopefully as Alvin downed his drink as quickly as if it were buttermilk and made a wry face. Do you live in Port Blair? She asked him. Yes, I live with my parents. Do you like that? She asked. Oh, I don't mind. My parents are very good. They don't even ask me anymore what time I get home at night, he said proudly. How old are you? I don't think Mrs. Nature told me. 30? She had to have another scotch on that one, just one, and he joined her. Then they ordered dinner. The scotch had made her brave enough to feel she could play Sarah Bernhardt, and she decided to have a terrible headache right after dinner. I met a famous author when I was in MO, he said brightly, as if it had just occurred to him. You see, she thought, I was wrong. I should have given him a chance. He's probably got some gay, continental life behind him that I never even suspected. Oh, who? What's his name? Oh, Ernest Hemingway. I was sitting in a little cafe in Spain with some friends, and he was sitting at another table. He colored slightly. Asked him for his autograph. And what happened? He gave it to me. She looked at him expectantly, but it seemed that was the end of his story about the meeting with the author. Good grief, she thought. Even Mr. Shalimar can do better than that. The restaurant where they were was, unfortunately, an AFL-BCIA one that specialized in getting diners out in time for the theater. Besides that, they had been the first ones in the dining room. When they were drinking their coffee, Caroline looked at her watch expecting it to be at least 9 o'clock of the following week, and found to her horror that it was only 6:30. The scotch had worn off, and she didn't quite have the courage to act sick. Could she say, oh, I'm just in time for the 7 o'clock express? I guess anyone who had you working for him would be very lucky, Alvin was saying, with moist admiration in his eyes. She felt too sorry for him to dislike him, or at least, to hurt his feelings. All she wanted was to go home. Go home, go home. Home seemed like a refuge. A beautiful place where she hadn't been for such a long time. And to go home was such a simple thing, but impossible for her right now. I'd like an after-dinner brandy, she said. Oh, he seemed startled. Then he rallied. 2 brandies, miss. They served the brandy in large, lovely double brandy glasses. Tell me about the mannequin business, she said. I've talked enough about publishing. You would have thought she had asked him to stand up and give an address before a crowd of hostile hundreds. He seemed to be searching his mind frantically. Well, it's just a family business, he said at last. It's a family business. Just the family. But what do you doff spy? Put microfilm in their necks. She thought, we make mannequins for store windows. It must seem very dull to you. Oh, no. Well, you have such an exciting life and everything. All those authors, whatever you really like is exciting, she said. Do you want to do that always? Or do you want to get married? Can't I do both? He looked nonplussed. I guess so. I never thought of it that way. I'd like another brandy, she said. And then I have to go home, because there's a manuscript I must read for the office tomorrow. It's so early, he protested. It's a very large manuscript. 1 brandy, please, miss, and the check. If there's anything I hate, she thought, it's drinking alone while someone looks at me the way he's doing now. If there's anything duller than drinking with someone you don't like, it's drinking alone and being watched by someone you don't like. Aren't you going to join me? Please. Oh, all right. He downed the entire glass of brandy in 3 gulps with that same medicine-taking look on his face. And then suddenly the wry look smoothed out and he blinked several times. The second one's not so bad, he said. You get used to the taste. He raised his arm and with an astonishing show of bravado snapped his fingers for the waitress. I hate people who do that, she thought, relieved to have something definite to hold against him that really was his fault, and not just an accident of personality and upbringing. I have to go now to catch my train, she said. I've never met such a nice girl as you, he said. You're the nicest girl I've ever met. The waitress had appeared out of nowhere with 2 more brandies, and he drank his. I don't want any, she said, pulling on her gloves. We'll go, he said. We'll go. He took her brandy and drank it too, looking a little self-conscious. Waste it, he murmured, and then, unaccountably, giggled. She stood. Can we go? He fumbled with the change and then followed her closely to the door, almost treading on her heels, like an inebriated St. Bernard. Don't trip, he breathed, clutching her arm. She had never had less intention of tripping, but was not sure she could say the same for him. Just as they reached the front room, she realized to her acute embarrassment that Mike Rice was sitting at the bar, alone and gazing solemnly into the mirror. She looked down into her collar, hoping he would not see her with Alvin Wiggs, the only boy Mike had ever seen her with. And what an example. It was too late. He had caught sight of her in the mirror and was swiveling around slowly on the bar stool, his eyebrows raised. Hi, he said. He nodded at her and at Alvin, and completed the turn to the business end of the bar. But she could see that he was still watching her in the mirror, his face as deadpan as ever, just a touch of amusement in his eyes. That, said Alvin. Shh, who? He's a writer. Oh, introduce me. I want to meet one of your writer friends. He was pulling her back now. To the bar, Alvin, please. Can I buy you kids a drink, Mike said. His pleasant tone and the reference to herself and Alvin as kids seemed to take away some of the onerousness of being here with a neurotic balding man 10 years her senior who had gotten drunk on 4 double brandies and was determined to act 10 years old. Alvin was holding out his hand. I want to meet a famous author. I'm Alvin Wiggs. Mike allowed his hand to be used as a hitching post and looked quizzically at Caroline. She took a deep breath. And this is Mr. F. Scott Fitzgerald, she said. F. Scott Fitzgerald, said Alvin. Slowly his face lighted up. Oh, we studied you in college. You wrote about the 20s and things. I'm very glad to meet you. I'm glad to meet you too, Mike said. He looked from Alvin to Caroline. You know, Alvin said, I thought you were dead. Isn't that awful? Disgraceful. Mike said solemnly too, should be ashamed to tell me such a thing. I'm hurt. Oh, I'm sorry, Alvin said. Here, let me buy you a drink. I'm so glad to meet you, Mike gestured to the bartender for a round of drinks. Caroline could see that he was a well-known customer here. She wondered when he would start the round of 3rd Avenue saloons Mary Agnes had talked about. After midnight, probably. Are you 2 old friends, Mike asked. We just met tonight, Caroline said, on a blind date. She looked at him significantly. Wasn't that lucky, Alvin said happily. He swallowed his drink, said thickly, excuse me, with a beatific smile, and looched off in the direction of the men's room, bumping into a couple on the way. Oh, I can't stand it, Caroline said. I can't stand it. Despite her embarrassment, she was so relieved to see Mike. He seemed like such a sane and welcome face that she began to laugh. What are these blind dates? He asked curiously. An old American institution of mismating. Haven't you ever been on one? No, he said with rev. I married when I was 18. Besides, no one I knew cared whether I had a social life or not. This barbaric custom of yours must be typically Port Blair. It isn't at all. How are you going to get away from him? Will you be all right? It's all my fault, she said. I made him take that first step on the lonesome road with Demon Rum. How was I supposed to know he was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? I really feel responsible for him now. I think I should get him safely on the train. He's supposed to take care of you. If he can't, then ditch him. That's kind of inconsiderate. Oh, and was it considerate of him to take you out and act the way he's doing? I guess he can't help it. He has such an inferiority complex, and I think I scared him. He smiled at her, this time a smile that reached the rest of his face. It made him seem like someone she did not know. You always make excuses for everyone, don't you? He said. She wasn't sure whether he meant it as a compliment or just the opposite. That's not such a bad thing, is it? She asked. It's bad for you. Why? If you insist on liking the wrong person, don't to yourself fairy tales that he's this or he's that. That he's pathetic, that he needs your help, that you put him on his worst behavior. Just admit you like the wrong person, but don't give yourself the wrong reasons. She looked up and saw Alvin's white face in the distance as he made his way toward them through the darkened room. She realized that she had already forgotten what he looked like. I like that, she said, but it certainly doesn't apply to me and Alvin. He's just someone who came into my life by accident, and he's going right out again after tonight. I don't necessarily mean it for you and him, Mike said. I mean it for you and anyone. It might be someone you get to care about. Someone a lot closer to home. He was looking at her intently as he said it, and suddenly she felt, for an instant, a cold shiver pass through her. It wasn't the chill of foreboding, but rather of excitement, of the unknown, of that same unreality coming true feeling she'd had when he had told her Mr. Shamar was afraid of her. Who? She said, who? It's a good thing I'm not as drunk as Alvin Mike said, or I might tell you and make a fool of myself. She sat there looking at him in surprise for a moment, until Alvin came and jovially wedged himself in between them. But she had something to take to herself and think about, and it was enough. She felt astonished and warmed by her own feelings. Really, what had he said? Nothing. And yet, it could be a great deal. All the way home on the train, sitting next to Alvin, and pretending to look out the WD in Dow, she found herself thinking about Mike. She let the thought of him enter her mind and stay there, unconsciously. He was nearly twice her age. He was used and bitter. As with any dissipated person, there were many things in his past life that she was sure would arouse her sympathy. A disappointment, a heartbreak, a failure, events and misfortunes that might not deserve that sympathy, but which would be sure to receive it from a girl like herself to whom they would all be new and shocking and therefore poignant. That was what he was trying to warn her against. She was sure. And because he cared enough to warn her against him, she found herself totally disarmed. He must care about her in some way that was more than friendship, she was thinking, or he would never have said anything. The possibility of a romance between herself. And Mike was the strangest thing that had ever happened to her, and yet it was beginning to seem the most natural thing in the world. She could not help but compare Mike and his sophisticated understanding of her secret thoughts with the succession of dreary boys she had been out with since she had been graduated from college. With each of those boys, it seemed as if there was a barrier, hurled up because she was a woman and he was a man, and each wanted something from the other. It was a kind of juvenile competition. With Mike, it was as if because he was a man and she was a woman, each had something to give to the other. She wasn't afraid of him. To her, something dangerous meant being hurt. She didn't believe Tlayer could be any other kind of danger in becoming involved with him. The hazards of a changing outlook, of a mind that could become as old as his, seemed very far away. Chapter 5, Greg Adams, in the shower, looked a great deal better than she sang. Nevertheless, she was happy. For her, which is to say tonight she had a general absence of depression, and so she sang and splashed. Hurriedly, so that she could wash all the soap off before the day's supply of hot water disappeared. A tune was going through her head, some old thing from her mother's flapper days. Life is just a bowl of cherry. Life is just a bowl of weevils. She sang to that tune. Da-dee-da-da-da. Life is just a bowl of weevils. Da-dee-da-dum. She had managed to get 12 lines in a morning soap opera for next week, with promise of more in the future. As usual, she was playing a teenager, baby-voiced and excruciatingly sweet. That slight Western accent she hadn't been able to get rid of didn't hurt either. She had noticed that all the nauseatingly sweet little children who did commercials, gee, Mom, this tastes like more, seemed to have a Western accent. Perhaps some executive power thought it made them sound more childlike. She was going to a party tonight with Tony, who was in her acting class and was one of her semi-platonic friends. They lent each other money and took each other to parties where free food in each core could be had for a minimum of charm. He was younger than she and had long hair that fell into his eyes when he shook his head, and he mumbled when he spoke. If you asked him a question, he would wriggle and scratch himself and look at the floor as if he were feeling out the line. And finally, he would grunt some extraordinarily emotional result like, "Yeah, let's go to the movies." She knew it was an act, that when he was very excited or overwrought, he lapsed into the most beautifully modulated Shakespearean diction she had ever heard. All the boys in her acting class were like that. The ones who took her out, and the ones who were married, and even poorer, and the fairies. She was bored with them all. In her messy, overcrowded closet, she found a red dress she had liked and had forgotten she owned. He was a meeting people dressed for parties. A blonde girl in a red dress always seemed to be able to manage without introductions. It wasn't as if she hoped to meet anyone non-boring at Tly's party. Actually, she was only going there because there would be food and good scotch, and it would be a way not to be alone. When she was alone in her apartment, she could feel the stifling sensation she had learned to fear creep up on her. One minute things were all right, and then all of a sudden a 10-pound weight would establish itself on her chest, and she would hardly be able to breathe, let alone swallow. Jazz music on the phonograph and cheap vermouth helped a little. Telephone conversations with her friends by the hour helped even more. But all of these were merely sedatives to dull the panic and lift Tly weight. They could not remove it. Around the circle of light by her bed, there were shadows waiting to envelop her as soon as she put down the telephone receiver and broke away from the reassuring voice at the other end. Sometimes her cat would slip up to her and rub his furry head against her ankle, and, looking down at him, she would feel an immense, overwhelming affection for him. My little cat. Pencil-lined ribs to move Whitley breathing as he slept. Signs of life to remind her that there were other worlds inside of other people's skulls, even inside a cat's little skull. It made her feel less alone, less stifled, less afraid of something she could not really name. You could die in New York behind the locked door of your apartment and no one would ever know until some neighbor complained of the smell. Yes, your friends would say then, I remember I hadn't heard from her for some time, but I thought she was just sulking. Or I thought she had a new job and was busy. Busy. How Greg thought? Busy being unemployed. Tony was an hour late, which was like him. When he finally arrived, she was so lonely she was even glad to see him. Hey, he said, I remember that dress. He leaned down and kissed her on the cheek. She remembered then with embarrassment that she had worn the dress on the evening of the first and only night she had gone to bed with him. No doubt he thought of the dress with sentiment. No wonder she had forced it to the far end of her untidy closet. It was a night and a dress she wanted to forget. There were some lovers you could have once, and only once, and then you never wanted to have them again. Not that they weren't skillful and considerate, because they usually were, but they had held each other out of loneliness and fear and curiosity and lust and hoped that this time they would find something beautiful. And in the morning they would find sheets that looked like a geographical terrain, and perhaps an overturned ashtray on the rug beside the bed, and no trace whatever of the face of love. Come on, she said, taking his hand. They'll eat everything before we even get there. The party was at the apartment of a middle-aged actress whom Tony knew. The room was dark and already filled with smoke and people, as if they were leftover observers from a fire. Greg coughed and moved with the clockwise motion of the crowd to the window end of the room, hoping she would find the bar there. With an icy glass in her hand, she felt better Tony put a lighted cigarette into her other hand. Now she had the props and the play could begin. A play called Isn't This Fun? See those three men over there, he whispered. See the tall young one. You know who he is. Tony must have been excited. He had said 3 complete sentences, one right after the other. Who? David Wilder Savage. David Wilder Savage had been one of the first people she had heard of when she had come to New York. It was an eccentric name, and he suited it. Most people thought it was a pseudonym, taken so that he would be remembered. For whatever reason, it had worked. Nobody ever referred to him as Savage. They went through the whole routine. He had been one of the boy wonders of Broadway, producing his first play at 25, a hit which had run for nearly 2 years. Every play he produced after that was a success, until the one he had done at the beginning of this season, which had closed in 4 weeks. The magic name David Wilder Savage had been the only thing to hold it on Broadway that long. The play itself had little theatrical excitement. Thoughtful, fragile, and of limited appeal, it had been written by a man who was one of the few people David Wilder Savage had ever been close to. Like many men who cut a heartless swath through the worlds of business and of bedrooms, David Wilder Savage had one friend whom he cared for deeply and whom he protected. They had been roommates in college, the author and the producer, and in the 14 years since their graduation, the author had been working on this one play while holding various jobs to make a living. That fact alone would have warned away nearly any would-be producer. It would have warned away David Wilder Savage before anyone else, because if anyone had an instinct for success and failure, it was he. But this closest friend had been killed in an automobile crash in the spring, and in the fall David Wilder Savage against the advice of anyone who dared to give it to him, put the play on Broadway. It was not because he was confused by his bereavement. He knew exactly what he was doing. It was one of the rare gestures of sentimentality, and even more, of love, from a man who was known for his ruthlessness. It was ironic that his one act from the heart should turn out to be a debacle, but not unusual, since David Wilder Savage himself would be the first to say that if a con man ever tried to save a child from drowning in a moment of pure goodness, he would be sure to be eaten by a shark. "Do you know him?" Greg whispered back. "I read for him once. He probably doesn't remember me. Do I dare go over and talk to him?" "Why not?" "It's a party," Tony said without much enthusiasm. "Come with me." He kissed her lightly on the temple, his cheek bulging out with an hors d'oeuvre he had just gobbled. What for? Pretty girls have much better luck alone. She was relieved that he didn't want to accompany her, but when she had worked her way through the crowd to where David Wilder Savage now stood by himself, she was taken with panic. What could she say to him? "Hello, I'm an actress." She might as well hold her hand out and ask for a dime for a cup of coffee. It would be greeted by the same enthusiasm. What an attractive man he was. Satanic. That was the word for him. 35 years old and on top of the world. With that knowing, civilized face looking down at all the ambitious people like herself, who were sidling up trying to think of clever things to say to him. She looked down at her glass, wishing she could find a place to get rid of it. "Who tly hell are you?" he said pleasantly. She looked up at him, surprised. "Greg Adams. I'm David Wilder Savage. And as they always say at cocktail parties, what do you do?" "I'm a dental assistant." He smiled. "That's a surprise. You look like a parolee from boarding school." "I was once, and very sophisticated too. Black lipstick and all." "Have you read a book called Many Faces?" She had heard of it. The author was a Portuguese. "I read the reviews." "That's not much help." "You'd be surprised," she said, "how well I can discuss a book from the reviews. And a movie from the cast. Sting on the marquee." "That's right. There was an American couple talking French at her elbow." She nodded toward them. "And with people like that, I can say, I really understand your French perfectly, but I can't speak it back to you because my accent is unintelligible." "I'm sorry you haven't read Many Faces," he said. "I would have liked to know if it did something to you, too." "And what?" "I'm a producer, and I think there may be a good play in it." He had a way about him, something in the intimate lowering of his voice, that made her feel as if she and her opinions were very important to him. Actually, why should he care what she, a working girl he'd met at a party, thought of a book? Because he thought she was the average public, of course. A girl who came to Manhattan every day on the subway from Queens with her tuna fish sandwich in a brown paper bag, who lived with her parents and washed her hair every Thursday night and went to the movies with her boyfriend every Saturday night. And yet, he had that way about him. "I'll read it tomorrow," she said. "It'll be too late to tell you what I think, but now I want to read it anyway." "You'll love it." Anyone else, she was thinking, could say "you'll love it" and it would be small talk, a mere figure of speech. With David Wilder Savage, the sentence was like handing someone a gift. It was as if he wanted to give her the bit of pleasure of discovering a new idea, a magical story. Charm? She thought. Charm was just a word before, but now I know what it is. It's anything this man says. He touched her arm. "See that couple over there? They've come to the wrong party. There's another one in the apartment downstairs, and that's where they were supposed to go. Now he wants to leave, and she says she's having a good time and wants to stay. They're having a fight." They were a young couple, a pouting bosomy girl in a white dress and a weak-looking man. "Look at the gestures and angry faces," Greg said, laughing. "They look like a TV set with the sound turned OJBF. Did you ever do that? Turn the sound off, especially on a commercial. It's like an old silent movie." "I know. I've been doing it for years." "Look," he said, amused. "He's leaving and she's going to stay." And without even so much as a glass in her hand, Greg had expected to be afraid of David Wilder Savage, and was surprised that she was not at all. She felt instead as if he and she standing here together laughing and observing the others were something special. The in-group, and everyone outside of the two of them were the out-group. "Where did you get that diction?" he asked her. "In speech class." You want to be an actress. I am an actress, one might say. Not a dental assistant. She laughed. No, I'm really an actress. I just didn't want to waltz up and tell you because it would have sounded so damn clubby. Like someone coming up to you at a cocktail party and saying, "We have something in common," as if that's supposed to make you like him. Exactly, she said. Exactly. Are you here with someone Tony would understand? She thought. He'd do the same thing himself if he could. No, she said. No, I'm not the dentist. No one. This is a very boring party, don't you think? She looked up at him. Not right in Tlia's corner. He took her arm. Let's take the comer with us. I'll get my coat. She slipped up to the hostess' bedroom to retrieve her coat, looking for Tony out of the corner of her eye, but hoping that she would not be able to find him. She paused for an instant at the mirror, looking at her face. How dark her eyes were, and how much they revealed, even to herself. She had noticed another quality to David Wilder Savage, something just under the surface, a kind of hidden cruelty. It was as if he were basically a ruthless person, but had a tender side that he would show only to the one person he cared about. His charm told her that the person could be her, and her sense told her it was a lie, a trap, one that few girls could be cautious enough to resist putting to a test. She pulled her coat on and lifted her long hair out of the collar. She was a near stranger to him and he to her, but she had seen the challenging combination of cruelty and tenderness. She saw it all in an instant, as a drowning person sees his life pass before his eyes. And then she plunged out of the safe room to where he was waiting for her in the hall. It was odd. Ordinarily, she would have been impressed and delighted by the wave of recognition that went around the room when he took her into the restaurant for dinner. She liked walking into a room with someone who was known. It gave her confidence. And at the back of her mind was always the hope that she would be introduced to or discovered by someone who could help her in her career. But with David, she found herself resenting the table hoppers who took his time, the greeters who demanded his attention. Everything he said to her seemed important, and every time he turned away to speak to someone else, she felt as if she had left the safe. In group for a moment, and she remembered who she was and how alone she would be again in an hour or two. When they had finished dinner, it was after midnight. The diners had left Tly restaurant, and the drinkers had appeared. "Come uptown to my house," he said. Knowing herself, she tried to think of any inane remark to play for time. Why? He looked at her perfectly calmly, as if it were not an inane remark at all, and said, "Because I want to make love to you." "I don't want to," she stammered. "All right," he said. He helped her with her coat, and they went out to the street, where he hailed a taxi. "Where do you live?" She told him, and shrank into her corner of the taxi in a state of growing depression as the street slipped by. He was taking her home, and she didn't want to go home. Like a child, she was afraid of the dark and loneliness, and, like a child, she reached out and tugged at his sleeve. He took her hand. She knew she would never see him again, and she couldn't bear it. He was something strange and exciting that had come into her life, only for one evening, really just a few hours. And what was she to him? Someone he'd had fun with, whom he might remember if her name were ever mentioned to him again. "I don't want to go home," she said. "Where do you want to go?" "Then, I don't care. I just can't stand to give you up." He didn't seem to think it was a frantic or silly thing to say. He simply leaned forward and gave the driver's address, and then moved back and put his arm around Greg, comfortingly, with none of the appurtenances of passion. She felt suddenly as if what she had just said to him was somehow romantic and important. She had never seen an apartment like his before. She had always felt that you could tell more from one look at a person's apartment than you could from an hour of talk with him. There were the people who didn't care about their homes at all, and there were those who cared but had nothing to add to them. David's apartment must have contained over 1,000 books. Books were in the tall bookshelves that lined an entire wall of the living room, and they spilled over to every chair in the room. On the round dining table were at least a dozen play scripts. On the floor beside the table was a large straw basket filled with magazines. He took off her coat, and with the coat still in his hand walked to the phonograph and turned it on. She noticed his records then, long playing records, 4 feet of them from end to end. At the far end of the room, between the bookshelves, was an old-fashioned fireplace with a carved black marble mantelpiece. It was a much-used fireplace, with a fire screen and blackened fire tools, and logs waiting to be burned among the coals. He put her coat into his closet and knelt down to light the fire. In front of the fireplace was a long black sofa. She could imagine him sitting there in the dark, staring into the flames, and it made him seem more satanic looking than ever. "Would you like brandy?" "Yes, please." He brought a bottle of brandy and 2 glasses to the low coffee table in front of the sofa and sat beside her. The music on the phonograph was a classical piece that she had never heard before, and he had it turned up loud, as if he really enjoyed hearing it, not as if it were background music to a seduction. "Have you really read all those books?" she asked, gesturing. "Yes, and those magazines, and those scripts." "Yes, I'm always looking for something." On one of the side tables beside an armchair there were no books at all. Instead, there was a large silver-framed photograph of 2 men on a sailboat in summer, smiling and squinting into the sun, wearing white trousers and white sweatshirts and standing with their arms loosely flung around each other. She stood and wandered over to it. One of the men was David, many years younger, with a softer, vaguer face, and the odier was a rather handsome, sensitive-looking young man with the build of a large tennis player. "Who's that Gordon McKay?" "Oh," she said, "the one whose play you just put on?" "That's right." His voice seemed to have tightened, as if he were very conscious of the way it sounded in Fly Room. She didn't know what to say. She couldn't say, "I'm sorry about your friend's death," or "I'm sorry about your friend's flop" either. Somehow she felt that if she said anything like that, it would destroy instantly the intimacy she and David were feeling together at this moment. "I'm sorry I never got to see the play," she said finally. "More brandy?" he asked, and filled her glass without waiting for a reply. She remembered something Tony had told her once about David Wilder Savage and Gordon McKay, some spiteful thing, the sort of thing unsuccessful people often say about successful ones. A kind of name-dropping gone one step further to become insult-dropping. What was it he'd said? Oh, yes. No one knows for sure whether they were in love with each other. But now we'll see if he can ever put on another hit or if the light has gone out for him. That was the worst thing she had ever heard said about David Wilder Savage. Most of Fly Kids at the class discussed instead hit theatrical genius and his reputation as a wolf. Why did people have to say that 2 men were in love with each other when they merely loved each other? Couldn't people realize what a rare and miraculous thing closeness could be without trying to dirty it? She felt suddenly that the world was full of cruel and silly people like Tony and her family and a long string of girls she had gone to school with and boys who had pawed her. All of them separate and lonely and spiteful and afraid to love each other. Like a sleepwalker, she went to the sofa where David was sitting motionless. The room was dark and the redness of the flames shone on the fabric of the couch and made it look black and red both, and on the glass of brandy on the table, making it shine like a garnet. She touched his face. He did not pull her down to the couch, but stood up in one swift gesture, put his arms around her and took her to the couch with him. She felt a touch of surprise at his first kiss, as she always did with anyone's, because the shape of the mouth never seemed to be related to the feeling of the kiss it gave. With his, she felt astonishment that a cruel mouth could be capable of such warmth and gentleness. "You have the softest mouth in the history of the world," he murmured. "And you too." He was taking off her dress and slip and stockings without ever removing his lips from her mouth and face, as if his hands were an efficient, unobtrusive part of him and his lovemaking. She had